Thank you all for coming. I'm today issuing a veto letter concerning LD 1708, titled An Act to Create the Pine Tree Power Authority, a nonprofit utility to deliver lower rates, reliability, and local control for Maine energy independence. As the detailed veto letter will demonstrate, we've given this a great deal of thought. I have read the bill over many, many times and done a lot of research, my staff and I, and come to the conclusion that this bill, in its current form, is just not the appropriate vehicle to do what it aims to do or intends to do. Let me just say right off the bat, though, the performance of our current investor-owned utilities, particularly CMP, in recent years has just been abysmal, with inexcusable billing errors, unacceptable delays in the restoration of service, and inexplicable confusion over the cost of connecting new solar projects to the grid, substantial rate increases, including recently, and now, just last night, a draft report, audit report that questions CMP's management structure. I think we're well beyond the point of debating whether our utilities can do better. They can, and they must. Our utilities, these large corporations that are granted a monopoly over the vital service of delivering electricity to Maine consumers, large and small, must provide the high quality, reliable, efficient, basically competent service that Maine citizens and businesses all expect and deserve. This bill, 1708, is arguably one of the most consequential bills ever to be considered by this legislature. It's a bill, the impact of which would touch the lives of that this bill was being advanced too quickly without having undergone adequate public scrutiny and without having addressed substantive concerns that were raised by many and continue to be raised by many people. The bill was printed May 17th, heard in committee May 20th, worked in committee June 1, and voted on in the committee that same day after a substantive amendment was produced. One last-minute amendment on the floor made the new entity liable for property taxes, but did not permit an evaluation of the effect of that change on the entity's ability to issue tax-exempt bonds. That's kind of fundamental, because the premise of this bill is that this new entity will be qualified under federal IRS rules to issue tax-exempt bonds. And the savings from doing that, compared to the profits embedded in the investor-owned utilities' bottom lines, will save ratepayers money and give us the potential to do other things with the grid. But that wasn't analyzed. And there's a serious reason to believe that making the entity liable for property taxes actually promotes the opposite effect, that it may be ineligible for tax-exempt bonds. We've explained some of this in footnotes in the letter. But even despite those last-minute amendments that were designed to gain the favor of specific legislators, LD 1708 has engendered substantial and unabated continuing concerns from respected community members as diverse as Bath Iron Works and the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and 3 former PUC commissioners, 2 of them former chairs, very well-respected experts, and the mayors of 7 Maine cities. Those concerns cannot be ignored. This bill's rush to enactment is particularly disturbing, I think, given where the matter was left just last year. Last August, the EUT committee considered the independent report of the London Economics Institute, the LEI Institute, that did a report that we authorized by law, authorized the PUC to contract for. That report raised a lot of questions, particularly about the level of rate, the impact on rates that this new entity or a new entity would achieve. And that LEI report recommended a lot more study and analysis of the tax effects of the entity and many other issues. And in response to that, the EUT did something fairly sensible. They voted 9-3 to endorse a commission or task force that would study the costs and benefits of a consumer-owned utility. Smart thinking. That task force was never created, and significant issues that LEI, the independent contractor, raised, such as the need for a business plan for such an entity, still haven't been addressed. They're nowhere addressed in this lengthy bill. Instead, LD 1708 just defers them to be dealt with by the authority's elected board. I think the stakes are too high for that. Basic due diligence demands that we have that kind of information before committing the state to this large venture. Well, among other things, the veto letter describes a litany of issues that have not been addressed. For instance, the bill says that the initial startup costs, the cost of acquisition and forming a new organization, all will be considered by the PUC as just and reasonable and passed on to the ratepayers. That's a big issue right there. How much is it going to affect rates? How much are they allowed to spend? There are no brakes on the entity. There are no guardrails here in this bill concerning how they can organize, how much they can spend to do what, to what end. But it'll all be passed on to the ratepayers, which seems a little counter to one of the main purposes of the bill. It also says that the referendum ballot question will be such and such a wording, dictating the ballot question in a very rosy fashion, without telling people the downsides, potential downsides, and the risks of the bill. It's been said to me that, well, this isn't really a question of whether you like the concept or not, or whether Maine needs a consumer-owned utility, but rather, will I and the legislature let the voters decide? That's a theme that I'm getting in emails from across the state. Just let the voters decide. Well, that would be easy. That would be the easy thing to do. But the voters of the state elected me. They elected me to evaluate policy matters in a fair and thoughtful way, I hope, and to take the steps I believe are in the best interests of Maine people. They elected me to do a job. If I were simply to pass along this major measure, one that I believe from research and analysis is deeply flawed, regardless of the intent and the good intentions of the sponsors and the proponents, if I were simply to pass this along to the people of Maine for a vote in November, I would not be doing my job. Instead, I'd be shirking my responsibilities as their governor, something I cannot and will not do. I certainly agree that change is necessary. No question about that. And I remain open to considering alternative proposals and to strengthening the authority, the penalties available to the PUC. For instance, there's a process in Maine law right now that the PUC could invoke to force the divestiture of a public utility's assets. That's one thing. We could do performance-based measures, incentives, and penalties like Hawaii is doing, strengthening those measures to take charge of our assets that deliver our lifeblood, electricity. The PUC has authority to hold an adjudicatory hearing, if they wish, to determine whether any public utility is unfit to provide safe, adequate, and reliable service at rates that are just and reasonable. So there are things we can do and should do now to strengthen the authority of the PUC. And fundamentally, I believe we must change the culture and the way the utilities do business in Maine. The utilities must serve the people, not vice versa. The American journalist H.L. Mencken said, "Every complex problem has a solution which is simple, direct, plausible, and wrong." I share the frustrations surrounding the service and performance of Maine's current largest utilities. But I'm deeply concerned that this bill presents a rosy solution to a complicated problem that, if implemented, would create a lot more problems than it solves. The bill that would change the delivery of services, I believe, doesn't deliver or won't deliver on its promises, the promises it intends to make to the Maine people, but can't, according to my reading of this bill, deliver on. The problems with the bill are substantial. They include, obviously, protracted litigation over the valuation of condemned assets, the possibility that the hostile takeover of the state's utilities will lead to delays in investments that are deeply needed to achieve Maine's carbon reduction goals, and problems associated with an inexperienced board that might try to run the state's major utilities, potentially under the operation of the same entities that own them currently, because this board would be contracting for the operation of the utilities to an operator that is best suited under an RFP, which could look a lot like or even be CMP and Versant, according to the provisions of this bill. If the idea of the bill is to get rid of CMP and Versant, it may not do so. It might well not do so. In fact, it might bring them back in another form. Well, for all these reasons, I'm today vetoing LD 1708, and I'm asking the legislature to sustain that veto. Thank you. Any questions? Hi.
Hi, Governor Mills. You just mentioned a couple of things you think that the state could do to strengthen authority and penalties available to the PUC. One, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit more about this divestiture law and how you think that might affect some of the challenges we're facing. And two, and if these are things we could do, why not put them forward?
Some of it is in current law. I just, in the last 2 years, appointed 2 excellent people to the Public Utilities Commission. I believe they will take the appropriate steps to rein in some of the misbehavior of the utilities. They have the ability to do that now. We talk about divestiture. It's an issue I'd like to look at and beef up in the current statutes. I'm not saying that the PUC should act today to commit to a hearing on divestiture, but it's a tool that they have. I want to look at what other states are doing too. There's a great article on the state of Hawaii and what they're doing, probably in a more progressive way than any other state in the country, to enhance and effectuate performance-based metrics, so that you don't have to wait for a rate case, for instance, to determine whether a company is doing the job they should be doing. Look at it in advance. Take proactive action. Keep your eyes and ears on the utility as it's operating. Not wait for a problem to exist, but anticipate and be proactive. You know, we could talk about things like making sure that any major utilities has a Maine-based board at some level to respond to the immediate needs of Maine people instead of waiting for somebody in Spain to call the shots. You know, that's one of the problems too, being owned by a foreign corporation. And it means just maybe incorporating some of the principles of what's called B corporations, you know, socially responsible corporations. incorporating some of those principles in those entities that we allow a monopoly for the operation of our utilities.
Governor?
Yes. Oh,
So in your letter, you clearly say that it may well be a time for the state people to retake control of the assets. So you are suggesting that a consumer-owned utility could be a possibility down the line. So you're not ruling that out, it's just the structure.
I'm sorry, I can't
You're
hear.
not ruling out the possibility of a consumer-owned utility.
Correct.
You're saying that this isn't
Right.
an adequate way to do it. Can you talk about?
I think what I'm saying is just where the committee was last August, when they voted 9-3 to respond to the LEI report that had serious concerns about basically the rate impact of that form of public-owned utility that was being proposed back then. Before you jump into that, do a thorough analysis, whether it's a publicly owned utility or a consumer-owned utility, and they are two different things. And find out one thing, whether it's possible legally. Check with the IRS, check with bond counsel, go through the hoops that are pretty detailed and time-consuming to determine what kind of entity could be allowed to take over those assets in what manner. I don't think this bill does that. Well, I've gone through that in the letter. You know, it's not even clear to me in the bill whether it's supposed to be a public entity or a private entity. There is like 4 different titles to the entity in the bill itself. Well, I mean, I hate to sound like a lawyer, but that means something to me. Names have meaning, and they determine the tax-exempt status of an entity, for instance, and whether or not they're eligible, whether they qualify to issue tax-exempt bonds, which is the underpinning of the bill, the intent of the bill, to be able to issue tax-exempt bonds. Not clear at all to me or to others that that's so. Yes?
Governor,
Oh, go ahead.
have you told your appointees to the PUC that you think they should work to try to force divestiture? Have you gone that far?
No, there are pending matters before the PUC, and unlike some, I tend not to interfere with pending matters before the PUC. I consider them to be sort of in a quasi-judicial capacity. Whenever appropriate, my energy office intervenes in proceedings and analyzes proceedings. Right now, we're reading the draft audit report from last night, to see if it's something that we need to weigh in on or analyze further, or take any action in response to. I don't direct my commissioners or my appointees to the Public Utilities Commission to take a particular position on a particular matter, but they have ideas, I'm pretty sure, about how to reform the process and strengthen it, and make it better.
And have you had, if I could follow up?
Yes, please.
Have you had direct discussions yourself with the leaders of Versant, of their owners,
No.
of CMP and Versant, about any of this?
No. I've gotten plenty of incoming from all sources, and it may be that they've sent messages. There's a lot of incoming from all sources, but those aren't people that I've reached out to consult with on this issue. You can pretty well guess where they stand.
No, but I mean, for you to tell them, give them a piece of your mind.
Let me read the report from last night, then I'll make that call. What the hell are you doing? No, I don't know. Yes, please.
You know, you call this their performance abysmal, and if
Yes.
this isn't the answer, what is? Where do you hope things go from here, and is there any direct action you do plan to take?
Well, I have an energy office that understands Title 35 a lot better than I do, and I'll be consulting with them about any measures we might propose in January's legislative session, for instance. And I would obviously want to do our due diligence before that time to figure out how we can best address the exact needs of the consumers in a way. And there's a balancing act. Obviously, we have strong climate goals that we're implementing right now, our EPS, our energy efficiency goals, our greenhouse gas emission goals, and we want to make sure those are incorporated in the regulation of utilities. Right now, the balance is in favor of addressing rates rather than these broader social goals. I've written to ISO New England to insist that they incorporate those broader social goals and climate change goals in how they regulate the utilities and the grid overall. These are large and important issues.
And if lawmakers brought back the idea of a task force to study this more in depth, is that something you would support?
I think I've said that it deserves a lot greater and in-depth analysis before we sign off on a major proposal such as this. Yeah. Yes, please.
Can you talk a little bit about the last minute amendment that, it talks about the property taxes and how that evaluation didn't go as planned? Just considering this bill requires, the retail customers of CMP and Versant Power, that's a big deal. Can you talk a little bit about that?
About the property tax issue?
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, the bill that was printed in mid-May and then amended in late May on the morning of the work session and the vote, that bill had a provision that said, because they wanted to keep it tax exempt for tax reasons, obviously, it said they'll be exempt from income taxes and exempt from property taxes. Didn't say anything about sales taxes. We don't know about sale of electricity, whether that still doesn't say anything about sales taxes. But because there were complaints about that, because it said there would be pilots, payments in lieu of taxes. This is a thing that legislatures from time to time think about, trying to impose voluntary taxes. Well, you can't really mandate something that's voluntary because it's voluntary. And so a number of people were very concerned about that. The possibility of foregoing $90 million in property taxes, I forget what percent, like 3% of the entire property tax liability across the state of Maine. That's a huge impact. So people expressed those concerns, and several legislators expressed those concerns particularly. Well, in response to that, in the last minute, the bill was amended, I think on the floor of the House, just 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago, to say, oh, well, now it'll be subject to property taxes, not pilots in lieu of taxes, but property taxes. Well, there must be a reason that they were not liable for property taxes in the first place, and I suspect it had a lot to do with tax exempt status in order to get the low interest rates, right? And then sort of lobbing that on at the last minute, there was no evaluation of the impact of that provision alone on how this bill would be effective or not effective as it intended to be. Does that answer your question? All right. I'm not a property tax expert, but I know there's a reason why legislators can't just sort of every couple of years say, well, I want the university to pay taxes now, and I want the hospitals to start paying taxes, and the churches, they get such free services from the towns, they should pay something for it. They don't end up doing it because they really can't enforce that. Steve, yeah.
You alluded to something about PUC, maybe could do more, or maybe there might be some overhaul regulations within the PUC governance structure.
Yep.
To maybe crack down on some of these problems. We've heard a little bit of that during the debate over this bill, that, the answer is maybe through the PUC. Do you believe the PUC has done its job in regulating this utility?
Good question. I think the new PUC has the capability to do the job. And I think that I've put two really good people on that commission. And I think they have the energy and the ability to do the job with absolutely no ties or affiliation with any of these utilities.
If I might,
Go ahead, please.
With your new appointees, can it do its job without any of this governance overhaul that you're talking, or authority?
Good question, and I don't have a detailed answer because I know that, and I have talked to Phil Bartlett in general terms about how, in the past, about how we could beef up their authority. And I know there are good ideas out there. I'm not an expert in that area, but I know that we could increase their ability to impose performance-based metrics, sort of like Hawaii is doing, which I think is pretty exciting. Look at this procedure for divestiture, which ultimately would force a company to divest itself of its assets in Maine. Get rid of CMP, for instance, theoretically. How does that happen? Has it ever happened? Could it happen? I'm just throwing that out there because I think it's a really interesting idea. Ways to incorporate competition in the transmission and distribution investments in Maine. Why is it we have to give a monopoly, total monopoly for the most part, to two major utilities? Is there a way to incorporate some better, healthy competition? And again, performance-based incentives and penalties, that kind of thing. We need to be more proactive. Look at the future of the grid, where we're going. It's obvious from reading newspapers and other things that these current utilities did not anticipate the large spread of solar energy development, for instance. I don't think anybody did, really, to the extent that it's happening now. How can we be prepared for the next slug of renewables, and how is the grid prepared to accommodate those renewables? We want to be sure that it is sustainable.
Any last questions?
Oh.
Hi, I know you touched on this in your letter, but what would you say to the voters who didn't vote for you, who want to decide if this is a good idea for the state?
I'm sorry, say that again? What would I say to people who didn't vote for me? And I don't know who they are, so I didn't give them, they don't have labels, but would I say to them about this bill?
Yeah,
Oh.
because in your letter, you were talking about how the voters of the state elected me, so I
Oh.
was wondering for those who
Oh,
didn't.
I meant generically. Look, I got elected, whether individuals voted for me or not, but you know what I mean. I'm elected by the voters, by the people, not just by a certain segment of the people, but by the people, and I take that job very seriously. And the idea that a governor should actually weigh all the pros and cons and read a bill many, many times over, do the research, and ask for help from her staff to do the in-depth research that's required to adequately understand such a bill is my responsibility. It's my job, and that's why the people elected me to this position. You go ahead, please.
Yeah, just almost in a similar vein, supporters have said that if this doesn't make it through the legislature, they're going to try to whip signatures and take it to a referendum anyway. And I just wonder what you think about that this question may come before voters eventually and, may be unchanged between now and then.
Well, that's up to them. That's up to the folks who feel strongly, and I understand the passion behind this idea. The concept is a very appealing one. But if they do, they can come back next year to the legislature too. That's an option. If they do decide to collect signatures and put a bill on the ballot as a people's initiative, which would go to the legislature first, I hope they look deeply at what I'm saying today and what I've said in the veto letter and make changes and don't put this particular bill out as it is.
All right,
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
By the way, we've now taken action on this legislature, a total of 1,734 bills were printed just this year. 1,734 bills were printed. 635 of those have been enacted. And I have signed 491 bills. 491 bills until, I've reviewed about 600 and something, well, more than 600, 650. I've signed 491 bills into law, and as of today, I will have vetoed 21 bills. Less than 3%. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Is this mine?
You can take it.
Okay. Thanks.